right there. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, my name is Alistair, and I'd like to welcome you all to Queen's University for what's going to be a very informative evening. Just to let you know that we're not expecting any fire alarms this evening. If you do hear the fire alarm, could you please make your way to the exits either at the back or the front of the room? And the assembly point is just at the front of the building. Could I ask you to turn your mobile phones on to silent, please? And then we'll begin proceedings. And I'd like to hand over now to Professor Nola Hughes-Dundon. Thank you.
Lord Lieutenant, Chief Constable and distinguished guests, good evening to everyone here tonight. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Great Hall at Queen's for the second annual Royal Ulster Constabulary George Cross Foundation Lecture. My name is Nola Hughes-Dundon. I'm Professor of Innovation Management and Policy and Pro-Vice-Chancellor here at Queen's. And on behalf of Queen's, we're incredibly proud of our association with you through this lecture series, aligned very much with the mission of the George Cross Foundation to mark the sacrifices and to honour the achievements of the RUC. Last year, we had the privilege of launching the first annual lecture with an excellent inaugural keynote address from Sir George Hamilton, who retired as Chief Constable here in Northern Ireland in 2019, after a very long and distinguished career in the police. Building on last year's lecture, tonight we are equally fortunate to be able to hear from another speaker with also a long and distinguished career, Mr. Ali Soufan. As we will hear in a moment, Mr. Soufan is a leading expert in national security and counter-terrorism. We can also look forward to a fascinating address tonight on global security challenges, terrorism and violent extremism in an evolving security landscape. So, on behalf of all of us here at Queen's, thank you for doing us the honour of speaking this evening, Mr. Soufan, and thanks also to Professor Richard English for chairing the discussion. Again, you are most welcome to Queen's, and I trust that you will have a most interesting and an enjoyable evening. I will now hand over to Mr. Stephen White from the RUC George Cross Foundation to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
My Lord Lieutenant, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Chief Constable, distinguished guests, friends. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to what is the second Royal Ulster Constabulary GC Foundation Annual Lecture. The RUC was formed over 100 years ago, the 1st of June 1922, and this year is our centenary year, and we've had a number of very special events already. Some of you have supported those, and we really appreciate that. The foundation was established in 2002 with the purpose, as the Professor said, of marking the sacrifices and honouring the achievements of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. But it also has other purposes. We're not simply looking back and commemorating, all be that important in terms of remembrance. We also believe that we have a role to play in education and enlightenment, in explanation about the role of criminal justice, law enforcement, and those who uphold the rule of law, and in doing so protect the human rights of all our communities. So one way in which we do this is through this lecture. We believe in communicating and educating where possible. So this is a very important evening for us as part of our communication strategy, our community engagement strategy. I'm very, very grateful to everyone who is here tonight and who made tonight possible. Your support is tremendous and greatly appreciated. I appreciate what Queen's have done. Richard has been a great supporter from the start, and the the Community Engagement Directorate under Alistair have done a marvellous job as well. So we thank you for all the arrangements, for the hospitality, and for the warm welcome you've given us already. But I especially want to thank my friend Ali Soufan. If I was to properly introduce Ali, I would probably take up half his lecture time. He is a man who has an illustrious career as a supervisory special agent in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He investigated some of the most atrocious Al-Qaeda and other Islamist extremist-inspired atrocities, attacks on the USS Cole, attacks on the East African embassies, and of course, the terrible tragedy of 9/11. He then had a career beyond that, in which he has become a global expert on all aspects of national and international security, and I've had the pleasure of working with him in a number of regions in the world. I consider him an expert and also a close friend. So, Ali, you're doing me the great honour, and doing the Foundation, and doing the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and doing Queen's University a great honour in being here tonight. Ali is a prize-winning author. He has been the subject of TV, dramas, documentaries, and movies. He has lived a life, and hopefully many more years to live ahead, and I'm absolutely delighted that he has given his time to join us over the next few days, but particularly tonight for this lecture. So I want to ask you all to give a fine, warm Northern Ireland welcome to my good friend, Ali Soufan. Ali.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing introduction. Good evening, Lord Lieutenant, Vice Chancellor, Chief Constable, distinguished guests. It's a great honor for me to stand before you here today in this great city of Belfast. I must begin by, again, thanking our gracious hosts. I thank Queen's University Belfast for bringing us all together this evening. And to Professor Richard English, it's an honor to finally meet you. I've been reading your work for a long period of time. To the faculty, the staff, and the students, and for each and every one of you who supported this event. And I must extend my sincere thanks to the RUC George Cross Foundation, who have kindly invited me to deliver the organization's second annual lecture. This esteemed organization has done so much this year to highlight the 100 years anniversary of the formation of Northern Ireland's police service, the RUC, which in 2001 was renamed and incorporated into the Police Service of Northern Ireland. The RUC GC Foundation also honors the sacrifice made by more than 300 police officers, as well as the sacrifices of their families. For over a century, officers have contributed to building peace here in this great city, as well as to efforts internationally. The knowledge shared from experiences and lessons learned in Belfast have been studied in police and security academies literally around the world. It is truly a privilege to be with you tonight. I share my thanks with my dear friend Stephen White, the chairman of the foundation, and his continued service not only to the great city of Belfast, not only to the RUC, but to the noble mission of police and law enforcement around the world. I really thank you, my friend. And I share my gratitude as well to all the members of the boards of trustees of the RUC Foundation. I thank the royal patron, His Majesty the King, and note my condolences of Her Majesty the Queen's passing last month. As we begin today, I would like to commence by stating the maxim of the RUC Foundation, marking the sacrifices and honoring the achievements. These words provide an important foundation for why we are here today. I've been invited to speak on the topic of global security challenges, terrorism, and violent extremism in an evolving security landscape. Wow. Fortunately, I think the organizers are kind enough to choose a topic that would allow me to speak without making a complete fool of myself. However, I will try, and I will still minimize that risk by making myself as short as possible. I hope to share with you a few observations regarding the challenges posed by the current threats in security landscape, and welcome a conversation with all of you and Professor English later on. Frankly, I cannot do justice to the complex geopolitical, economic, social, and security challenges the world faces today. It's not a pleasing picture right now. 1 year after the withdrawal of the coalition forces from Afghanistan, we see what seems to be a resurrection of a terror safe haven under the Taliban regime. The impact of the withdrawal could be immense in terms of international security. This was further evident when Al-Qaeda's leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was recently found and killed at a safe house in Kabul, Afghanistan. The withdrawal from Afghanistan seems to offer significant opportunities for organizations like Al-Qaeda and could provide an operational space necessary for them to recruit, to rearm, and to train. However, Al-Qaeda today is nothing like the group that attacked us on September 11, 2001. Al-Qaeda's core has been weakened after a period of high leadership attrition, but its regional affiliates worldwide still pose a threat, particularly the Yemen-based Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, or the various groups in the Sahel regions of Africa. And we must remain vigilant with the so-called Islamic State. After facing the brunt of aggressive and sustained US and coalition counterterrorism operations, and after losing territorial control of their so-called the Caliphate, ISIS has suffered attrition to its senior leadership, and its command and control over its so-called provinces has been weakened. The group will continue, however, to try to grow, especially their regional network in West Africa, in the Sahel, in South Asia, while attempting a resurgence in Iraq and Syria. Those so-called jihadis now are even opening new fronts in part of Africa, like Mozambique and the DRC. Another issue is that thousands of ISIS fighters remain in SDF detention in Syria. The detention cannot persist indefinitely, especially given that the detention camps dually serve as ISIS recruiting ground, especially for children, since there are many children and families who are also in these camps. There are more than 64,000 individuals in Al-Hol camp alone. And the issue of repatriation remains a political non-starter for many Western countries. Our justice systems must be shown to be sufficiently robust to investigate and prosecute those who have committed crimes. Unfortunately, accountability for ISIS-associated crimes, including the horrific genocide against the Yazidis, remain very low. Counterterrorism measures over the past 20 years have put significant pressure on these groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, forcing them to decentralize and refocus their efforts on regional struggles. New hotspots of violence include the Sahel, South Asia, and many parts of Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where the mix of conflict, where the mix of bad governance and heavy-handed approach by the states. These conflicts actually gave them an opportunity and created a space for them to recruit and to control. Ladies and gentlemen, Afghanistan is now far from the only country where Islamic extremists or violent non-state actors hold sway. Large swaths of Libya, Somalia, Mali, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq are all, to a great or lesser extent, ruled by non-state militias, creating an arc of instability from North Africa to South Asia. As these groups expand their power, we appear to be in retreat. Over the past decade or so, the United States and her allies have systematically dismantled their influence across most of the region's flashpoints. In fact, US embassies in several countries, including Libya, Yemen, Syria, and now Afghanistan, have been closed. The United States demonstrably cannot control its nominal allies, countries like Turkey or Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. And in Iraq, despite the vast sacrifice of blood and treasure by both nations, we are forced to tolerate political leaders who flaunt their membership with the Iranian-controlled militias. Today, this arc of instability seems to be growing across the world, and the vacuum left behind by Western and coalition presence present an enormous opportunity to be exploited by violent groups. But the terrorism and violent extremism challenges we face today cut across the ideological spectrum, and so we must also manage threats from emboldened far extremist violent groups. The threat posed by white supremacy and far-right extremists is actually a transnational threat. From Norway to New Zealand, from the United Kingdom to the United States, extremists have formed transnational networks to recruit new members, to finance their organizations, and to disseminate hateful propaganda. In the United States, domestic terrorism today poses the most acute and deadly terrorism threat to my country. The threat posed by far-right violent extremists is growing, and our security agencies have issued several warnings about this threat over the past years. Disinformation, conspiracy theories, and the proliferation of online manifestos continue to radicalize far-right violent extremists who in the United States have ready access to guns and ammunition. The white supremacist and far-right networks propagating this violence are both similar and different from the jihadi networks. The far-right tend to be composed of a more diffuse, non-formalized networks with dense online connections and a host of lone actors that emerge from a broader far-right ecosystem. Their violence tends to be marked by the prevalence of low-complexity, low-tech, and copy-paste attacks. What's most concerning to me is that the United States and other Western governments are at a clear disadvantage when it comes to combating white supremacist terrorists. We have been almost uniquely focused on one single threat for 2 decades. Here are the warning signs I see. White supremacists from around the world are increasingly forming global networks, much like the jihadis did in the 90s and in the years leading up to 9/11. Online platforms makes it easier and more accessible than ever before for these people to connect with each other. White supremacists make propaganda warning of an alleged great replacement of white in the same way jihadis talk of a supposed war against Islam. White supremacists promote violence as an appropriate way to defend the purity of the race, just as the jihadis use violence to protect what they call the purity of their religion. Both groups recruit followers and reinforce their message through social media. While jihadists make martyrdom videos, the supremacists post online manifestos. Both purposely target youth, including children, to their violent causes. You have seen this phenomenon here in the UK too, with increasingly young age of individuals being arrested for far-right activities. In the lead up to 9/11, we failed to recognize the threat that Al-Qaeda and the global Salafi jihadi movement posed to the United States and the world. That mistake cost us dearly on September 11, 2001. For that reason, I hope we address the growing white supremacy threat and the transnational nature of the challenges so we will not sleepwalk into history repeating itself. These leading international terrorism challenges are not taking place in a vacuum. They are playing out in a world being shaped by monumental power shifts, where democratic ideals are constantly being challenged, and where communities face rapid polarization. After 2 decades of fighting the global war on terrorism, the geopolitical focus has shifted away from violent non-state actors back to nation-states. There has been a noticeable pivot from counterterrorism to great power competition. Both national and international security priorities and defense and security budgets have followed in this direction. The starkest example of this shift is Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, which has brought the reality of interstate conflict back to Europe for the first time since World War II. But it's not just Russia. Across the world, major powers like China, as well as regional powers like Iran, seek to challenge the current international order and replace it with something else. And within this context, both the United States and the United Kingdom and other allies and partners are grappling with counterterrorism fatigue following years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. I must emphasize the message that this balance between great power competition and counterterrorism cannot be an either-or scenario. We can and we must do both. And we should harness the best practices and lessons that we learned over the years to target that specific threat. We have built up a robust international legal and policy framework that calls for a counterterrorism response based on compliance with international law. We have built security partnership and deepened our understanding of the drivers of mobilization and radicalization. We must harness these positives to address today's diverse security challenges. The United States, alongside our long-standing partners like the United Kingdom, must be able to conduct counterterrorism operations, must be able to address states from non-state actors, and doing so while we compete against nation-state adversaries such as Russia and China. Moreover, the threats posed by terrorists and violent extremists are not mutually exclusive from those posed by states who may manipulate this regional proxy to carry their interests. Another major source of concern is the global weaponization of information. The way we consume information, the way we engage in dialogue is today grappling with the weight of dangerous and persistent disinformation narratives intended to sow confusion and discord. We need to learn to navigate global information ecosystem, which is increasingly undemocratic, exclusively anti-government, and extremely anti-truth. Across the world, we have seen the worrying rise of conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns, to include false narratives around stolen elections, COVID-19, 5G technologies, anti-vaccines, and mass movements like the Keynote conspiracy folks. With people increasingly spending time online, malign actors have abundant opportunities to access vulnerable individuals around the world. These conspiracies cause tremendous harm to communities caught up in narratives of lies and falsehood. They are also contributing to a rise of violent anti-government movements in the United States and internationally. In the US, over the past years, we have seen the worrying intersection between conspiracy theories and the calls for violence and domestic terrorism. And this is not a trend unique to my country, but one also sowing discord and polarization in Europe and around the world. Another concern is that in light of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, we have witnessed a boom in Russia-Ukraine narratives online, including baseless conspiracies, which have been prominent in far-right online channels. Worse, prominent personalities in the media and politics have laundered extremist narratives into the mainstream to serve their own political objectives. All this chaos and confusion leaves a space for malign actors, both state and non-state, to exploit societal fault lines, often with a view to delegitimize democratic governance, free press, and human rights. There's an urgent need to build resilience to disinformation, including through digital literacy and working with tech platforms to counter false information and the bots and the algorithms that are promoted. The relationship between technology and human rights will be just as important. As we seek to make sense of the current security threat, we should keep in mind the rapidly evolving global landscape these same threats are able to abuse and exploit. Geopolitics directly impact domestic events. Conflicts that have long been mostly dormant have the potential to flare up again. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenges are many. We also cannot ignore the economic consequences of a global pandemic, the harsh ramification of the war in Ukraine. Add to it rapid inequality, supply chain dislocations, food shortages, high energy costs, slower growth, and soaring inflation. Given these global economic uncertainties, the intersection between violence and crisis will be more important than ever for the world to manage. I would like to conclude by repeating the important motto of the RUC-GC Foundation: marking the sacrifices and honoring the achievements. Reflecting on our past will be the key to honoring our success in the future. History is a vast warning system, and I hope we adhere to its flashing signals. I am sincerely sorry if I depressed some of you today, but it's a great honor to be here with you, and thank you for your time.
Ali, thank you very much indeed. That was brilliant, wide-ranging, compelling. There was a lot in there that was quite depressing. So before I turn over to the audience, their questions, I'm going to, if I may, start by asking you a question about your own country, about the United States, because much of what you described there sounds very persuasive to me. The danger of conspiracy theories, which are prevalent and deep, the polarization politically, the right-wing political violence, which is growing, which, as you say, is not just a national, but a transnational phenomenon, the easy access to weapons, the meddling from other states elsewhere to try and promote division. There's an awful lot that's negative there. Could you say a little bit more, you mentioned some of it, but could you say a little bit more about what needs to be done and what can be done in terms of building resilience in the US? Because it's not just in the US that we need things to go well. The whole world needs America to be non-polarized, non-violent, and you have people now writing books about, are we on the verge of another American civil war and so on. Could you say a bit about in your expert judgment, Ali, what needs to be done in the States to combat some of those combined threats that you eloquently spoke of?
Oh my God, if I have the answer, I'll win the Nobel Peace Prize. The situation is very complicated in the US, as you know, and as you watch in the news. But I think the political leaders on both Democrats and Republicans need to realize that either they will learn from history or they will become history. And this is a choice that they have. This hyper-partisanship might probably benefit people for their short-term political goals. But when you think midterm and long-term, this is going to be, this will have a disastrous consequences, not only to the United States, but to the world. The world needs America. America is the global order. And I think we need to kind of like, with power comes responsibility. We need to be very responsible towards this. Unfortunately, a lot of people making money out of this divide, media entities, cable news networks, individuals who basically kind of, thinking that they can write the laws for, and it has significant impact. And there's a lot of, global reasons for the reason America is like this. Look, I think globalism created more wealth to humanity than we ever seen in human history. But the politics of globalism is horrible, and it left a lot of people behind. So we have the tendency to say, oh, people are racist or people are, ignorant. But, when you look at folks in rural America and other places, they don't have jobs anymore. The factories closed. Globalism, they want borders back, not to stop humans from coming to their countries as much as to keep what they have, what they still have. And I think we need to have a review, a political and economic review for the world after NAFTA and for the world with globalism, and figure out how to fix the politics of globalism. Because if we don't fix it, I think, what happened in Italy recently, or what almost happened in France with Le Pen, I think it might happen in the US, and it might happen in many other countries around the world. So we need to basically look at ourselves in the mirror and figure out what do we need to change in order for the people to believe in the system again, to believe in the institutions again, to believe in government again. Otherwise, it's not going to be very difficult for the Chinese or the Russians or even the Iranians to put fake stuff on platforms and people repeating it, because guess what? They don't trust the system.
Thank you very much indeed, Ali. We've had a brilliant lecture. We've now got the time for there to be questions from the audience. There are microphones, which will mean that you'll be able to be heard when you ask the question. So who'll start us off with the first question? There's one here on the my left-hand side, please, Morris. Thank you very much. Richard?
Hello, that was absolutely fascinating. I'm just trying to keep this big picture. Could I just ask your thoughts on the influence of climate and water, for example, on global tension and terrorism? Because we've seen lots of talk of migration caused by climate change coming up in the coming decades.
I mean, look, a lot of the conflicts that's happening around the world, if you look at it, it's actually because of climate change. The Sahel, Al-Qaeda is influential in the region, not because people believe in the ideology. I know some of the leaders of these groups don't believe in the ideology at all. They are secular. But you have a problem between, for example, in Mali, between the herders and between the farmers. So the government supports the farmers, Al-Qaeda come and support the herders. So a lot of these conflicts that we see in Yemen is probably going to run out of water soon. A lot of the conflicts that we see around the world is rooted in issues that comes from competing over resources and because of climate change. But unfortunately, what we're dealing with today, the impact of the war in Ukraine, energy cost, most probably cold winter that's going to hit Europe, it makes climate change be on the back burner for many countries. Now we're thinking about growth. We're thinking about how we keep our people warm in the winter. We're thinking about economy. And the last thing we're going to think about is the climate. And unfortunately, when we do that, it's going to have an impact on us down the road, because more and more people are going to leave their countries in Africa or in Asia. They're going to try to come to Europe. This is going to cause additional problems, and it's going to make the ultra-right, if you want to call them that, raise their political stocks. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. But unfortunately, I believe as much as we see it's like losing this one, right? As much as we see a problem with, sorry. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. And unfortunately, I think we need to deal with the climate change problem for many reasons, but short term and long term. And short term, many of the conflicts that we see, as we mentioned, they are connected to global warming. But unfortunately, I don't think we're going to do anything about it now. More important fish to fry, if you want to call it.
Thank you, Ali. Next question. This question here at the front. Thank you very much, Maurice. Thank you, Simon.
Well, thank you for that riveting insight. I was just probably going from the other side of the coin, from the strategic macro, just interested in your reflections. I remember when you sort of, in both the introduction and some of the things you talked about, we touched on the issues of the attacks in New York. And I remember sort of being interested in a book last year or the year before, I think from Matthew Syed here, called Rebel Ideas. And he introduced the book by a proposition that some of that happened because of groupthink. And I just wondered, in your sort of enormous perspective on experience of investigation, your reflections on the dangers of groupthink in addressing some of the issues before us at the moment.
Thanks, Simon. Ali?
That's a great question, and I think we always, when something bad happens, like 9/11 or like any other disaster, we hear all the analysts and politicians and heads of intelligence services saying, we could not imagine. We always have a failure of imagination. And we have a failure of imagination because we don't have a full understanding of what's going on. And politically, it's more expedient to put our head in the sand like we're doing now on so many different issues. But unfortunately, we can't. Like, people like us need to keep talking and keep discussing these issues. Exactly like what me and many of my colleagues were doing prior to 9/11, and many folks here in the UK and Scotland Yard at the time, SO13, they were very aware of the threat. But unfortunately, politicians in London and Washington were not listening to us. Terrorism is nothing, and let's focus on the bigger picture at the time. And that failure of imagination led to an event that literally changed the world. A lot of the things that you see today, geopolitically, strategically, it's all impacted by what happened on that day. And that gives you an idea of the horrific cost that we will pay if we fail to imagine again.
Thank you very much. Next question, there's a question here right at the front first, and then a couple after that, but we'll take the one at the front first, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I suppose just a couple of questions. The first question would be, do you advocate for the United States to be the policeman of the world, the counterphrase? And secondly, would you agree or disagree that the West, and particularly the United States and the UK, made significant mistakes after 9/11, the second invasion of Iraq, the interference in Libya, and even the Arab Spring in general, didn't suppress extremism and terrorism, but probably advanced extremism and terrorism within the world?
Thank you.
I think your question is very simple and very difficult at the same time. I'll start with the simple one. No, the United States should not be the police of the world. Absolutely not. Second, yes, we did a lot of mistakes after 9/11, and hopefully we'll learn from it. Third, we should have not went to war in Iraq. If you look at disinformation and misinformation today, why other countries like Russia will use it against us is because our own government used it against us. We believed our own press clippings about weapons of mass destruction, and both our countries created the original sin that caused so many problems to happen today in the Middle East and beyond. This is a simple one. Now, the complicated question for that. The last, what's the last part? I'm sorry, jet lag is kicking.
I suppose it says suppressing extremism and terrorism.
Right, the Arab Spring, that's it. The Arab Spring is a little bit more complicated because some of the countries, the rebellion, the revolution was very organic. Tunisia is an example. Even Egypt is an example. Others were not, like Libya and Syria. And that's why Libya and Syria are a disaster today, and they will continue to be, I think, for the foreseeable future. So the Arab Spring is complicated, but absolutely, I think we missed an opportunity to practice what we preach, to stand with the people and support the people, not trying to lead from behind, as it was called at the time by the Obama administration. Let regional countries take control of the situation, because these regional countries, oh my God, some of them cannot find, their way around a room, to be polite. And I think that created significant problems that we continue to deal with today on the international community and these countries also. Regionally, they continue to deal with it today. So the Arab Spring is a little bit more complicated. There was something positive about it and about our stance, but there was a lot of negative things also. And I think the way we dealt with it and the way we tried to do it from behind, I think that damaged our credibility, let's put it this way, around the world.
Thanks, Ali. Lots of questions coming in. I'm memorizing the order in which people have put their hands up. Joanne first, thank you.
Thank you. That was a fantastic lecture, and I think what you were able to give us was a great iteration of the huge challenges that we face globally and nationally as well. When you were talking, I was thinking actually about a book that I read a few years ago that was written by a Holocaust survivor, and her mantra in the most difficult circumstances was to look for the light. So I suppose my question is, if you had to look for the light, if you had to look for receptive contexts for positive change, where would that be?
Thank you.
Well, I believe I'm an optimistic person, and I believe towards the end, we will do the right thing after we do everything wrong possible. And this is part of our history. I think Winston Churchill has a quote about that, about America. I'm optimistic. I think these things goes in cycles, and we've seen these cycles before. We've seen it, last century. We've seen it in this century in the United States. We've seen it so many times. But towards the end, the pendulum always goes the other way. My fear that we don't deal with the issues I outlined today, we don't deal with it appropriately, and it's not going to wake us up until it's too late, like what happened with 9/11, for example. So that's why it's always good to advocate that the threat landscape is blinking red, and we need to pay attention to these things and deal with them accordingly. So, but there's always, we're humans. If you don't believe that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, I think we're going to have a big problem. So I truly believe towards the end, the right thing will happen.
Thank you. John Boucher there's a question. And then after John, there's people sitting next to him. They're also asking questions. But John first, please.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks for a great lecture. Very interesting. My question is more about sort of modern-day communications and platforms that seem to enhance and enable a lot of the bad stuff that happens. So a lot of the counter-terrorism attacks we've faced that you've talked about actually have been certainly enabled, facilitated in recent years by encrypted communications. A lot of those platforms come from the US that frustrated our ability to get ahead of those attacks. In London, a couple of weeks ago, there was a tragic inquest where a young girl looked at self-harm videos, committed suicide. The inquest, the coroner decided that they had a significant impact on her taking her own life. We see the conspiracy theories, the Sandy Hook case recently in America where one of your citizens has got to pay a lot of money out because of what he claimed happened but didn't. And your previous president was brilliant in using the internet to spread what I would say was inaccuracies. Recognizing privacy and versus security, how do we deal with this use of modern communication, social networks, so that we protect people? How do we tackle this?
I think this is a problem that, at least in the United States, we're still trying to find a solution for it, especially that we have something called the First Amendment, and the First Amendment gives a lot of protection. So we try to look into the situation and figure out, okay, is this organic? Is this a tweet or this post by some American who is really upset about something, or is it a part of a foreign influence operation? The problem that it's becoming more and more foggy, because you'll see a lot of Americans retweeting false conspiracy theories that was initially initiated by the Russians, for example. Recently, the biolab is a perfect example. The Russians tested that with their disinformation, apparatus, and they realized it started to gain influence, and a lot of people in America start repeating it in the far-right, channels. And then suddenly Fox News and Tucker Carlson talked about it on his TV show and laundered this whole lie into the American mainstream. So it is very complicated, and there's a lot of protections, constitutional protections, that prevent the US government to even monitor these kind of things. Like DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, for example, cannot monitor what's happening on Facebook or what's happening on Twitter. And the only time they will get involved is to kind of put true statements out about something that's being falsely promoted online. But sometimes when you do this in this day and age, it's too late because as Winston Churchill said, the truth, the lie travel around the world when the truth still, putting its pants on. And I think this is what's happening now with social media. So it is very complicated, and that's why I believe that we need to work with the platforms, and we need to kind of, figure out a way in how they manage their algorithm. Unfortunately, the platforms don't want their channels to not to have conflicts because that does not give them rating, that does not give them money. They want people to fight, they want people to argue, they want that passion online because that is the rating that they have. That's how they make money. I'll give you an example. When ISIS was beheading British and Americans, they used to put their posts on YouTube at the time. And literally, after an ISIS video, a horrific video of beheading a hostage, there was ads for American companies like Johnson & Johnson and other big firms who put ads on YouTube. And there was a big move against these platforms by these companies stopping their ads. And the moment these companies stop their ads, suddenly all these tapes don't exist anymore. Look, I don't think Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or Google or any of these things care about the greater good. They care about money. Figure out a way to hurt them there, and suddenly they will be as straight as an arrow. But I think it's very complicated because sometimes they have the money, and when they have the money, they read the laws. And unfortunately, we get stuck in a situation trying to figure out how to manage this horrific problem in Western democracies. It's not going to affect dictatorships because they shut down the internet. If they want to work in Russia or in other countries, they have rules they have to obey. But this will impact democracies because we have freedoms, and people take advantage of this. It's complicated, and I think we're moving more and more towards working with these companies, not as governments only, but also as private sectors, as NGOs, as ad agencies, to have them work on a better algorithm system that will stop the significant impact of misinformation and disinformation campaigns, especially when it's coming from foreign countries and foreign adversaries.
Thank you. There's a question here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, thank you so much. I have 3 questions. So, depending on time, we'll see how it goes. One on right-wing, one
Well, I will have 4 after you're done.
one on jihadism, and one on etymology. I'll start with the most complicated one, on right-wing, for myself, I think, at least. So, speaking about the differences and the hardships between right-wing and jihadism.
Sorry, can you just put the microphone a bit near? That's
Yeah,
thank you.
absolutely. Sorry about that. So, discussing the hardships and differences between jihadist material, propaganda, and whatnot versus right-wing. In my personal experience, working on jihadist material, bloody material, booklets, training, educational material for children, for instance, whatnot, it could not come remotely close to the vile nature of right-wing material I reviewed. It's very available worldwide, and most importantly, the focus on it is on its subtlety, so the subtle nature of the right-wing material we find online. It's non-linear in time and space. That's also very important. And basically, from Breivik to Taran to Rogers, Breivik was influenced by Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, for instance, and he was also influenced by a lot of other authors of fictitious work. I insist, fictitious work. Then again, so how can we avoid that another 9/11, or how do we, I feel like we're failing to recognize how massive and how global, how dangerous this threat is. I'll bring one point of the gaming industry. By far, it's the most profitable worldwide right now, with even if you combine all of the other industries combined. So, and its users, of course, are mostly youth. Some of the latest right-wing perpetrators have used a lot of gaming linguistics and references and so on, for instance, so that the danger posed for youth is unmeasurable. This is very, very novel, very new techniques. So again, for instance, how would we avoid another 9/11, or how do we just limit this increasing danger that we're living in daily? After all, right-wing extremists have been or were some of the first people that have used or tried to use the internet since its inception in the 80s and late 70s. Thank you. That was
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, there is a big hole in our system, especially in the United States, because we don't have domestic terrorism laws in the US. So a lot of the things that a lot of the tools that we have to counter international terrorists, regardless if they were jihadis or not, do not apply on domestic groups. So it's, for example, the number one tool that we use to stop attack is material support, right? That does not exist with domestic groups. Most of the domestic terrorist organizations or extremist organizations benefits from the First Amendment. They can say whatever they want, and the Second Amendment, they can carry guns. So it's very difficult to kind of, counter them. Now, as for the similarities also that you asked, and I think the other one was about the gaming industries, there's a lot of similarities. We have a group in America called The Base. The Base means Al-Qaeda. They use black flags like Al-Qaeda. They use Al-Qaeda's manuals. They advocate for white jihad. For some reason, like Al-Qaeda, I made it to the recruitment video. They have, in one of the recruitment videos, they are shooting at me, and they have a Star of David on me. I don't know where the hell the Star of David came to me. So anyway, but they even use Al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine for how to make a bomb and all these kind of things. Many of the other groups that we have, they try to copy the jihadis in their propaganda videos and in the way they operate. So yes, there are a lot of similarities, and that's why about 3-4 years ago, I raised that alarm in an op-ed in the New York Times. And a lot of time, when that happened, people were like, what the heck are you talking about? And then they invited me to speak in Congress, and we had the longest hearing in the history of the Homeland Security Committee on that, and Republicans and Democrats were very concerned about showing the similarities between these two groups. So this is a major problem, and we started to see it now in the US. We've seen what happened in New Zealand with the Christchurch. We've seen what happened in Buffalo just recently. We've seen what happened in many places in America and in the West. You mentioned Norway. As for the gaming industry, yes, this is something that they use. I mean, just I think a year or two ago, there was people who wanted to blow up a synagogue in America, and they were recruited by somebody here in Europe on a game, a virtual game. So these things are definitely, dangerous. But even with all the negative and the complicated things that we're discussing, I think our law enforcement today way more able to stop another 9/11. Yes, we don't have some of the tools that we can use against an ISIS or against Al-Qaeda or against an international terrorists, but I think we have the experience and the institutions in place that we put after 9/11, and that's something positive about what happened after 9/11, to actually keep our communities more protected. So there is, to go with the colleague who asked the question before, there is a light, at the end of the tunnel. Now, is it going to be 100%? We don't know, but definitely I feel more optimistic that we'll be able to stop something like this from happening.
Thanks, Ali. Trevor.
Two questions. One on sort of the international aspect, and thank you very much for your lecture. In the multifaceted approach that has to be taken to deal with many of the issues that you've identified, is there also a role in the world for those democracies, Western democracies and others, to step forward in the soft power, the cultural engagement, the universities identifying young leaders in other parts of the world and bringing and engaging with them, and also the international aid aspects to society where you engage in those other countries and you actually start helping deal with the problems that they face? And has that one aspect of countering some of the issues that you've highlighted? And the second, bringing it back to home, is that, and certainly what we see after many attacks that we have in our societies, you hear afterwards that the person involved was known to the security services. And that was very much a case here during that, what we call the Troubles, that many of those who were committing those acts were known to the security services, yet in a democracy we struggled to actually deal with preventing them from carrying out the harmful acts that they ultimately carried out. And while there's been much challenge and quite properly, to the human rights issues, there also hasn't been the proper reflection on what more could have been done in a democracy to actually remove that risk from society, working within the general principles of democracy. And is there time that we actually look to see how we can look at the rules that we apply to see how we can protect the people from those who want to cause harm?
Right. Well, terrorism has been with us, I think, from the dawn of history. And the reason is, the people who are keeping the peace have to be successful 100% of the time. A terrorist have to be successful only once. Statistically speaking, we cannot stop every terrorist attacks. This is impossible. Now, a lot of times after an attack happens, we do this revision. We did it with 9/11. We called it a failure of imagination, which is baloney, because I don't believe in that failure of imagination. As a person who was involved in this, I was looking for these guys in Yemen. My government knew they were in America, and they didn't tell me until the planes hit the buildings, right? So this connecting the dots is BS. We have systematic failures sometimes for a reason or another. And I think because of these systematic failures, the terrorists take advantage of it, and they are able to conduct their terrorist attacks. Here in the UK, for example, do you know that the claims of responsibility for the East Africa embassy bombing was, launched from here in the UK? 1A Beethoven down in London, I remember that was my case. This is where they sent the claims of responsibility for the two attacks, and for the Tanzania attack and for the Nairobi attack. The claims of the declaration of jihad of Osama bin Laden also was sent from the UK. People like Abu Qatada al-Masri and Abu Hamza al-Masri, people like Khalid Fawaz, Adil Abdel Majid Abdel Bari, Brahim Idris, they created the headquarters for Al-Qaeda in London, right? And it was very difficult for us and for Scotland Yard, especially SO13, to convince the government that you guys need to pay attention to this, right? So there is sometimes a different political narrative. Sometimes people in different parts of the government think about it differently. They don't trust the people in the field, the operational people, you know, and until, excuse my language, the shit hit the fan, and then, you know, let's overreact, right? So in democracy, unfortunately, we can't just take people and put them in jail because we don't like them or because they are known to us and we don't have enough, you know, on the books to prosecute them appropriately. And again, the terrorists or the bad actors, they take advantage of this. So this is going to continue. The only thing we need to do is to be more vigilant and to be more active and to be a step ahead of them. And it seems in the UK and in the US, law enforcement have been very successful in doing just that. We disrupted way more terrorist attacks than the bad guys were able to conduct. So I think from that perspective, I think unfortunately they only have to be successful only once, and we can't do what other countries will do, who take all these bad people and put them in jail. I truly believe if we start doing these kind of things, we will create more terrorism. Most of the terrorists became terrorists because they, you know, were in Egyptian jails or Saudi jails, and after they left, they became more, and you can make examples about this from every conflict around the world. Now, as for aid, I think this is extremely important. We need to continue. Unfortunately, I don't think now with the economic problems around the world that aid is going to continue to be as it used to be before, especially with these conflicts that can create international terrorism down the road in Africa, in the Sahel, in South Asia, and so forth. So this is essential. The other issue about our soft power. Well, aid is part of the soft power, but if you want to talk about universities and talk about governments and talk about the ideals of the West, that's what makes us different than China and Russia, the ideals. We believe in democracy. We believe in human rights. We believe in freedom of speech. We believe in the freedom of the press. These are the values that people like the UK and the US for. Unfortunately, in the last 20 years, we have been freaking hypocrites. We've been freaking hypocrites. We lied about everything. And now we're telling people, no, you know what, now we're different. You know, now you have autocracy or you have Western democracy. Great, autocracy and Western democracy, but everything is fine and dandy about our position that we lead with our values, not, you know, with, and we're gonna, you know, support democracy, and then the gallon of oil, the gallon of gas goes to $5, and then we go and shake hands or fist bump MBS. How do you want people to believe us? You know, we can make movies, we can write books about freedoms, but around the world, people are not believing that shit anymore. You know, we need to walk the walk and talk the talk, not talk the talk and what he says. No. You know, democracy does not cease to exist because of $5 gallon gas, right? So, we need to be honest.
Thank you. There's a question here at the front, if the microphone, Morris, can come. Thanks very much. Richard?
Thank you very much indeed. The lecture was fascinating, I must say. On something surrounding what you're saying here about democracy and values and so on and so forth, one of the things that you said at one stage was about the need to build up more confidence in government, in the state, as and to get people more in line with that. In a popular or populist, perhaps, discourse, one of the things that affects ordinary people is what they see as the breakdown of law and order, and the inability of government and government agency, I better be careful here, the government and government agencies actually to enforce the legislation and the values that we're supposed to uphold. And we see this perhaps some on the American West Coast, in some of the states there, which seem to be descending into some kind of anarchy. Lots of complaints about the inability of the law enforcement in London, for instance, and in some of the other cities in Britain. So is there a problem? I mean, you're looking very much at the actors, the agents of disruption. But for ordinary people, is it not the fact that the state does not seem to them any longer to be capable of generating the kinds of qualities of life that they're expecting? You did touch upon that at one point, but I'm trying to emphasize the law and order issue.
Thanks, Richard. Ali.
No, absolutely. I mean, you know, I think people in our societies have been really disappointed because they believe that their government lied to them, consistently lied to them, and they were left behind. And their trust in the institutions have been weakened. And now you have demagogue politicians, they come and they kind of, you know, put oil on that fire. And the lack of trust in the institutions, the lack of trust in the system is becoming the mainstream. And I think in order to stop that, we need to have something called accountability. And if you don't have accountability, unfortunately, that trust in the system is not going to come back. And this is going to be on a micro level and a macro level. Like, for example, how many people were held accountable for the Iraq War? Zero. How many people get held accountable for torture? Zero. How many people get accountable for 9/11? Zero. Actually, all the people who were involved in not passing the information got promoted. Yeah. Not under Bush, but only under Obama. So when you don't have accountability, and then you come and talk about transparency and you trust the system, it's just like what Ronald Reagan used to joke about. You know, I'm with the government, I'm here to help you, right? No, people are not going to believe it. And you see it in the UK, you see it in the US. You see people who are left behind and then realize all the things that they fought for and they believed in was, you know, not completely true. And how do you bring them back to believe in the institutions? How do you bring them back to the belief in the systems? It's accountability. Accountability is an essential component of democracy. Without accountability, democracy will die. And unfortunately, in the last 25 years, we never have accountability for any of the major problems that impacted the life of the people, from the economic collapse in 2009, 2008, to, you know, Iraq War, 9/11, you name it. We never had accountability for anything. You know, in order to make the people believe in you, you have to believe in the people.
Thank you. There was a question at the back, Alistair. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your really excellent lecture and discussion. I think it's been really interesting. It's slightly overwhelming, however, to think about all of the things that you're raising. So I just wanted to ask you a question about what do we do going forward. We see at the moment there's huge sort of rethinking through national policies, whether it's the integrated review here, Germany's about to have a big review, and everything is being affected by Russia, Ukraine, right, and the rise of China, as you've outlined. But of course, we need to have some sort of coordinated response as the West, as a transatlantic community. And I wanted to ask, what maybe 2 or 3 things do you think going forward we can align around, that we think we could prioritise in the face of a really overwhelming set of threats and factors that you think will bring some cohesion to the states that are involved in that?
It's a great question. I think the world today is on an intersection, and it's essential to have a unified response to a lot of the threats that we're facing around the world, from China to Russia and beyond, with all the regional threats to include the one from Iran. I think Putin's invasion of Ukraine was probably, and I hate to put it like this, was probably the best thing that ever happened to the West. Because for the first time, the West is unified. Putin was able to do something that no American president since Bill Clinton was able to do. Have NATO to put their shit together, have Germany to raise their defense spending, have countries who always wanted to be on the side, like Finland and Sweden and even Switzerland, for heaven's sake, want to be part of Europe and want to be part of NATO. So we thank Mr. Putin for giving values to the meaning of being part of the West. But this is reality. I mean, I hate to think of this horrific war and what's happening in Ukraine in this term, but towards the end, in this lecture, we're talking about geopolitics, and this is part of the geopolitics. Now, it does not mean that everything is going to be milk and honey for the West. We are going to be dealing with a lot of the consequences of this war, economic consequences, energy consequences, and so forth. But this is an opportunity for us to build on this unity that we have and do it right, and move forward right. And that's why the people need to be involved with this kind of decision. I think it's going to be tough. Putin thinks winter has been always the best soldier for Russia. It helped him against Napoleon. It helps him against Hitler. It helped Russia. And I think he's waiting for a very strong winter to put Europe on its knees. Now, if that happened and he was successful, then I think it's going to be very problematic for liberal democracies around the world. But if Europe said, no, we've seen that, we're tough as nails. We went through World War II, we went through a lot of problems, and we survived it, and we overcome it, then I think he will be defeated. So I think it's essential for us to take this opportunity of a unified West and try to do it right this time. I think when it comes to China, I think the Chinese realized that it was a big mistake supporting Putin in his initial invasion. Now they are trying to pedal back. China, yes, it is the second largest economy in the world, but China is not a consumption economy. If the West is not doing well, if Europe is not doing well, if America is not doing well, if Japan is not doing well, these are the biggest three markets for them, the Chinese economy is not doing well. The third world and the development countries, those are places to get resources from. This is not places to buy your product. You need the EU, you need the US, you need the West, you need Japan in order to do so. So now they realize that if Putin was successful in putting that amount of economic pressure in Europe, they will lose the most. So this is, there's a lot of geopolitics happening in this. And I think the pandemic made the West realize that we cannot depend on the Chinese with the supply chain. And we're doing this new things like you see with the chips and every other things that we're doing in America in order to contain the Chinese influence when it comes to this high type of technology. So when you look at our policy towards containing China, our policy towards containing Russia, I think it is good policies. But I would hope that we won't mess it up because it seems we have a history of messing good things up. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Ali, I abused the place of chair by asking the first question. I'm going to repeat the crime by asking the last question, and I'm going to take you back to Afghanistan. You mentioned it in your lecture. As you were speaking, it struck me that between when the Soviets left Afghanistan and the planes flew into the towers, there wasn't enough attention by the UK or by the US in what was happening in Afghanistan. The eye was taken off the ball, and that had huge consequences in terms of that dreadful day. There was a great desire to withdraw from Afghanistan, to move out, and you were talking in your lecture about learning from history. Will the US, will allies continue to learn from history by paying enough attention to the dangers in Afghanistan, or is there a desire to wash hands of it and just hope that things don't turn out? Because it seemed to me Zawahiri being there was a warning sign, and yes, there was a lethal drone strike against him, but on the other hand, you can't have successful drone strikes against every operative. How anxious would you be that people will turn their back on the dangers of Afghanistan in terms of the new regime and its implications for the West?
Let me put it this way. First of all, I am 100% supportive of us pulling out of Afghanistan. I think we should have done that in 2003. We lost the war in 2003. I was there on the ground. I was seeing Al-Qaeda and the Taliban regrouping and coming back after they were on the run. And in the same time, we're taking all our military assets to prepare for the Iraq war. At that moment, we lost the war in Afghanistan. And the reason we stayed from 2003 until 2021 was just because nobody want to take that Band-Aid. That's it. All these costs, treasure, blood, I believe it was avoidable. The war in Iraq messed up all the calculus when it comes to Afghanistan. So we should have pulled out from Afghanistan a long time ago. However, I think the way we did it, number one, was very chaotic, and it's not good. It's actually propaganda for the extremists. Number two, in the short term, people who lived 9/11, people who lived the war in Afghanistan, they'll always keep it in their mind that we should not make that mistake. 10 years from now, nobody will care. Now we're monitoring. Now if Ayman Zawahiri appeared in a house that belongs to the Haqqani network in the suburbs of Kabul, we'll drone the hell out of him. We're there. 10 years from now, I really don't think so. I think people will forget it. Now, number three, even though we're allowing humanitarian aid to go to Afghanistan, I don't think that's enough because we're shutting down our embassies, we're leaving Afghanistan. If we leave Afghanistan, it does not mean Afghanistan is leaving us. So now you have a situation where the Taliban came from the mountains, and these monolithic groups that have nothing sometimes in common except their animosity to the United States and the West came from the mountains, and now they are running a government. They have to pay for teachers and civil servants and police and military. They have to understand international loans and all these kind of things that comes with foreign policy. And it's complicated. And when you don't have money and you don't have resources, what's going to happen is I fear that the government, the system, will collapse. So what you have is different Mujahideen leaders, let's use the terminology that we used before in the 90s. Mujahideen leaders, Taliban leaders, will start fighting against each other. They fight against each other for resources, for money, because each one of them, their tribe and their group, depends on them. That's exactly what happened after the Russians left Afghanistan in 1989. So when that happens, international terrorist organizations will come back to Afghanistan to support one group against the other, exactly like Osama bin Laden came back to Afghanistan from Sudan in order to support the Taliban against the Northern Alliance and Ahmad Shah Massoud. So history might easily repeat itself in Afghanistan as we speak. Now, is this going to happen in a year? No. Is it going to happen in 2 years? No. The Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989. 9/11 happened in 2001. See, we have calendars that we operate on in the West. Elections, governments, all these kind of things. National security strategies. They don't. right? It's like one Taliban leader said. He said, you know, you guys have time. You guys have the clock. We have time. And that's so true.
It's been a wonderful evening. It's been a real privilege to hear our lecturer. A few words of thanks from me in closing it. I'd like to thank the public engagement team for the logistics and for hosting the evening. I'd like to thank Professor Hewitt Dundas for giving a warm welcome on behalf of the university. A very warm word of thanks to Stephen and his colleagues from the IUC George Cross Foundation. It's been wonderful again, Stephen, partnering with you on this major lecture. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a typical Belfast sunny evening in order to come to this lecture. But for a brilliant talk, for wide-ranging insights, for a really authoritative survey and an enormous range of material globally, and for a fabulous fielding of questions, please join me in warmly thanking our speaker, Ali Soufan.